So today's daf in the Sechet Avodah Zarah, I got a light here. There we go. Is Chaf Dalid, I'm pretty sure. Chaf
I think
Dalid,
that's
yeah,
correct.
correct. So he finished the story of Dama ben Nitina, right? Very popular, famous story, at least for me. I remember it as a
Mhm.
kid. The
Ah,
non-Jew who had all these riches and respected his father, did kibbut avim, and didn't wake up his father to move the key. We were quoting the story here because it raises the question that we discussed on Friday about whether one can take an animal from a non-Jew, or we have to worry that every animal that's owned by a non-Jew has been the subject of intercourse and may have been, and therefore is puzzle from the Mizbeach. So we had the explanation for him yesterday and how much he got paid and all of those questions. And so today we're going to start. Um, where am I? Sorry. Reb Eliezer. So we're around 12 lines, I think he said. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 lines from the top of Daf Chaf Dalet Amud Aleph. Says Gemara, is it true that Reb Eliezer, who yesterday on Friday said that the reason you can't bring an animal, a para aduma, or maybe any animal from a non-Jew is because it says vayikchu, right? You have to take from you. You can't take from them. But he's not worried about revia. Rabbi Eliezer l'chayish revia. He's not worried that it was used sexually and therefore it's inappropriate from the mizbeach because of that use. But Tanya, but what about the following Breita? Now, there's another Breita in the Tosefta, which is different than the Breita we quoted yesterday, which says, Amrulo the Rebbe Eliezer, they said to Rebbe Eliezer in this context of our Mishnah, Ma'aseh v'lakhu min ha'ovei kochavim. There was a story where they bought a paraduma from a non-Jew, v'damma shmo, right? So obviously a very same story, different version of the story that we quoted yesterday. His name was Damma. Amrile, some say Remetz shmo. His name was Remetz. And so
mhm.
you see that you can buy a paraduma from a non-Jew. That was the question they asked Rebbe Eliezer. And Rebbe
Mhm.
Eliezer responded to them in the Tosefta, Amar lahem Rebbe Eliezer, Misham Raya. You want to bring a proof from the fact that they bought an animal from this non-Jew. That's true that they bought an animal from a non-Jew. But Yisrael, hayu mishamin oto, mishashin noda. A Jew was watching that animal, mishashin noda. So that from the moment the animal was born, it was had a mashgiach to make sure that no one touched it or did actions with it inappropriately. So you see clearly, and remember, Rebbe Eliezer said the problem was one of the problems was that you can't buy it from get it from a non-Jew. But the fact that you're watching it doesn't make him a non-Jew. The fact that you're watching it makes it that we know nothing inappropriate happened with the animal. So you see that Rebbe Eliezer cares about inappropriate things and he requires quote unquote a mashgiach. Says well, Rebbe Eliezer tarti itlay. Rebbe Eliezer is worried about both problems. The first problem is that you have to buy it from a Jew. Kicha, right? Chayish the kicha is how the Bach changed. No, kicha. V'chayish nami l'revia. So he's worried about buying it from a non-Jew, which is one problem. You have to take it from a Yisrael. And the second is that wherever you get the animal from, you have to be careful that it's an animal that was never used inappropriately. And for the second problem, I mean, the first problem we answered yesterday, maybe you had a buyer who was Jewish, who cleaned it up, you laundered it along the way. But the second problem is that you have to have a mashgiach who would watch it. Now, says the Gemara, that seems a little bit strange, right? Why would these people be standing outside his door as soon as his animal gave birth, watching it in order to make sure that no one did anything inappropriate? So it says the Gemara, Amar Mar, Yisrael hayu mishamrin oto mishashin noda. Right? A Jew was watching it from the time that it was born to ensure that no sexual impropriety happened with this animal. Says but so what if a Jew watched it from the time it was born? Maybe that someone slept with the mother when she was pregnant. And that would be a problem. The Amar Rava, Vlad hanogachat asura. Remember, an animal that gores is a dead animal, and it becomes basically for all purposes not useful in the mizbeach. It's supposed to be killed. And if it was pregnant when it gored, its vlad is also prohibited on the mizbeach because he vivladan nagchu. We think of it as an entity. It's a pregnant cow, right? Its fetus and it were part of the negicha, part of the goring, and they both are prohibited. And the same thing is true about vlad and nirvat. The fetus of an animal that was sexually assaulted, let's say, while that cow was pregnant would be asura. because the act happened to the cow and she was pregnant and he vivlada asura nirvu. She and her vlad were part of that act. So
This is part of the a consequence of the statement that the fetus is just the limb of the mother.
uber yerechimo, correct? Yes.
Yeah.
So correct. So meaning as an entity, the animal did something. Obviously, we're not assigning blame, right? With animals, we don't assign blame, right? It's not a question of intent. But the point is the animal was engaged in this act. The fetus was part of the animal. The fetus is part of the act also. So now think about it. You have a paraduma born to a non-Jew, let's say Dama ben Natina. You can watch that paraduma, you get the news, right? Red cow, red heifer born, very exciting. The mashgiach runs in there, they stand there and they put up a camera and they watch the animal till it grows up. But the problem is that you didn't watch the mother when she was pregnant because you had no idea she had a red heifer, right? So how do you know that the mother was not inappropriately used? Says Gemara, well, they did watch the mother. Ema Yisrael Yimishamrin Oto Mishashin Notzra. They watched from the time of conception. So now Gemara's going to ask in a minute, what do you mean? How they know this animal is being conceived, right? I mean, not every cow. How in the world would you have you're watching every single cow? So the Gemara will ask that in a second. But the first answer is from the moment the mother of the paraduma conceived it, they were watching the mother. Well, maybe that's not enough. Maybe there's a problem we'll see in a second. A mother, even before she became pregnant with this paraduma, maybe 2 years before, she was used sexually, and that would make her puzzle. Why? Ditznan. Because the Mishnah says in Tumura, Kol hapsulin legabe mizbeach, any animal that's pasul legabe mizbeach, for example, a nirvu, vladotem mutarin, right? Their vlad would be mutter. But Tani Allah, but we learned about this Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer oser. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees. Rabbi Eliezer says if the mother is pasul, the kid is pasul. So even if the mother was used sexually 5 years ago, she's pasul for the mizbeach, but you can never bring an animal that was ravua, that was engaged in that act, to the mizbeach. Even years later, if she gives birth, that baby should be usher. So hanicha, the Rava. Now, it makes sense according to Rava. You don't have that problem. Damar Rav Amr of Nachman. Rav Amr of Nachman said in the Gemara in Tamura, machloke kishnervu kshem mukdashin. The only question is if the mother was used while she was already hektish, right? So if the mother was hektish and she was used sexually, she becomes pasul from the mizbeach. If she then has a baby, that baby is also pasul from the mizbeach. Aval kishein chulin divrei kol mutarin. But if she was used sexually before she was hektish, before she was kodesh from mizbeach, then there's no problem. So then you understand by the paraduma, right? This animal, of course, was never hektish. The mother of paraduma is not a carbon. And so you don't have to worry about what happened before conception. You have to worry about after conception. And we'll ask in a second how you know they were watching it from that time. But you don't have to worry about what happened before conception. So that makes sense. But according to Rav Nachman, where am I? The Rav Huna bar Chinina, sorry. Rav Nachman, according to Rav Huna bar Chinina, the name of Rav Nachman, who said, "Machloke kishnervu kshen chulin." No, the argument of Rabbi Eliezer and Tanakama is if the mother was used sexually while she was not hektish, then according to Tanakama, the baby is okay, and according to Rabbi Eliezer, the baby is not okay. Aval kishein mukdashin divrei kol asurin. So then, ma'ikil meimer, what are you going to say according to Rabbi Eliezer, who is the person we're asking according to? If the mother was ever used inappropriately, the vlad is pasul. So how in the world would you know that this mother was never used inappropriately? Answers the Gemara, well, Ema Yisrael Ima Mishashinotzra. They watched the mother from the time that she was conceived. Says the Gemara, whoa. So again, we're going to ask in a second, how do you know that the mother is going to have a paraduma? But Nechash Doma Ravuli Ima de Ima, what about the grandmother? Right? Remember, according to Reb Eliezer in the interpretation of Rav Nachman, any sexual impropriety with an animal makes that child of that animal pasul. And we're assuming that means it makes the grandchild pasul too. It stretches on. So if the grandmother was used inappropriately, then the mother's mother of that cow, then that, etc. You could see. Cool. It says, like Charlie's shaking his head. There's no ein ledavar soap, right? You can't worry about things you don't know about. But says the Gemara, before we get, that's a good answer, but how in the world were they watching the mother? Amar Mar, so we said earlier, we are, I don't know, around 15 lines, 20 lines on the bottom. Yisrael hayu mishamin oto mishashin notzra. And we're watching this animal, and then we added a detail, maybe they're watching the mother from the time the mother was conceived. Now, minadi adinan. How in the world did they know which mother is going to lead to this paraduma, right? It's one thing if the animal's born and you see a paraduma, you get very excited. But how in the world do you know? Says Rav Kahana, well, you think paraduma is a coincidence? They have methods. People who breed animals, they can, just like Yaakov, remember, if you recall, he had all the methods to turn the animals into the spotted and the speckled and the things. You can make a paraduma because kos edom mavirin lefneh b'shat sholah le'zachar. Of course, you're mating your animals. You know when the male is coming onto the female. You can take a red cup and pass it in front of the face. I don't know, they might have had a technique. It must be the kind of thing that was complicated. And you could have the mother see red, and therefore her baby will be red. So they basically had a paraduma factory, essentially. And they had this technique where they bred out basically animals that were going to be paraduma. Now, says Gemara, well, if it's so easy, so amai damei yikarin. Well, they could just do that in China, right? What's the big deal? Just make a paraduma. And who says, why would it be expensive if there's just an easy technique? You give a little drop of something and the animal becomes red. Says Gemara, well, it's not so simple. Right? The thing is, yeah, of course you can mate animals to make them red, but you can't mate them to be perfectly red, right? Because even two hairs that are not red, pasul the paraduma. So someone's combing through the hair to look, right? But it basically means that you can sort of stack the deck, right? You would have places where they bred animals that had this trait, and they would put this thing in front of them when they were mating, and they would get a higher percentage, we'll say, of paraduma. So they knew the odds were good. Obviously, it wasn't easy and it wasn't straightforward. But because of that, basically, they were planning on making, it wasn't an accident that they had a paraduma. Once you say it's not an accident, then you could say, oh, they watched it. They set up mashgichim, we'd call them, and they observed and made sure nothing inappropriate happened in the pens of this breeding farm for paraduma. So that is how you'd have to explain it according to Rabbi Eliezer. I guess it's probably a little far-fetched. It says
But do you think that we actually own a black cat that has like 2 or 3 white hairs,
okay.
or is otherwise completely black. So that's
So you have the wrong
probably,
ratio, but you get the idea, right?
yeah, I get the idea. But this would open the possibility to breeding red heifers with modern genetic engineering.
I'm sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't know much about animal breeding, like how exact it is, if you can get every single hair, but you certainly can stack the deck. There's no question, right? So
Even though I've been able to back then, some genetic scientists can probably figure out how to do it today. Yeah.
well, let me just read the last words. Too. So what was so special about them? They had a chazaka, meaning they had animals that they knew were likely to give birth to red heifers, right? Red animals, and maybe they weren't perfect, but they would stack the deck. So, anyways, that was the explanation, and that's the end of that story of Paraduma. But we're not done with this sugya. So we are.
Isn't there a Masorah that there were only like 8 or 10 paradumas in history, and then and we waiting for Mashiach for another one, something like that?
Yeah, I think there was a Gemara in Sanhedrin that said something. I don't remember the exact number, maybe 10. I forgot the exact.
I think 10, I remember.
Yeah, something like that. I don't know. I mean, look, these are stories, I think we'll say. We are just want to give the place because it's in the middle, sixth to last of the narrow lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this continues the Gemara. Yativ Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafla, right? Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Yitzchak Nafla were sitting at Kil'ah to Rabbi Yitzchak Nafla. On the Kil'ah usually refers to like the portico of Rabbi Yitzchak Nafla. So they were sitting in front of his house. And Patach, they were talking, right? Sitting in rocking chairs. Patach Minav Amar once said, quoted our Braita, which said, V'chein haya Rebbe Eliezer posel b'chol hakarbanot kulan. So too, Rebbe Eliezer pasoled an animal that you bought from a non-Jew for any karban, not just paraduma, because we're worried that the non-Jew might have slept with the animal and that would pasol it. And so you have to worry about buying any animal from a non-Jew for a karban. Now, Patach idach minav amar. So one of them said that Braita, and the other one said to him, we don't know which one, my otrivi lechavurai Rebbe Eliezer. So what was the response? Rebbe Eliezer has a concern, right? That you are worried that if you buy an animal that it was used inappropriately, what did the chavirim respond? Says, so the person answered the pasuk that we read before in Yeshayahu of kol tzon kedar yikavtzulach, that all the flocks of the tzon, the sheep of Kedar, which is a place where they have very fancy and famously known sheep, I guess, will be gathered to you to be brought as karbanot. So you see in the future times, right? That's what it's referring to. You'll bring karbanot from, Pasuk continues, right? Keep going about the Mizbeach. That all the animals will be brought. So you see the non-Jews brought animals. Amar len Rebbe Eliezer. So Rebbe Eliezer said to them, well, that's not necessarily the case because kulan gerim gerurim gehem lati lavo. That's talking about future times. And in the future, they will all be gerim gerurim. And so they'll all be converts. And so in that time, animals from foreigners, so to speak, are not going to be a problem. Amar Rav Yosef, so said Rav Yosef, how do we know that? Ma'ikra. How does Rabbi Eliezer know that in the future all these people bringing karbanot will convert? Because the pasuk says, it's a pasuk in Sifanya, but also talking about future times. It says, "Ki az ehapoch elamin safa berura." I will then convert all the people to a clear language, a safa berura, and the pasuk continues. So they can call out b'shem Hashem and serve Hashem basically. So you see that in the future, in this whatever imaginary, hopefully soon time, all the people, all the nations will come and worship Hashem. This is where, well, how do you know? How do you know they're going to convert? Maybe they just are going to go against Avodah Zarah and come worship God. It doesn't say that they're not going to be, whatever practices they had, and which they're allowed to do, right? There's Shiva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, but there's not 613. And so maybe it just means in this pasuk in Sifanya, and maybe in Shayot too, that they'll come to worship Hashem and stop worshiping other idols, but not worshiping idols, but not that they convert. Rav Yosef says, no, because the pasuk continues, it says, Avdo Shechem Echad. They will worship Hashem with one Shechem, one agreement, Ktiv. And so, like we say, of course, on Rosh Hashanah, that means that they actually come to worship Hashem. That's what they discussed in their porch. Rav Papa had a very similar teaching. He learned the same thing, Matni Hachi. He heard it the same way. Rav Zvid Matni Hachi, Rav Zvid taught it very similarly as well. V'tirvayo Amri, they both, meaning Rav Ami and Rav Yitzchak Nafla is how we would say this, said, the earlier ones, said, V'chein hayu Rebbe Eliezer posel b'chol ha'karbanot. But the same thing, Rebbe Eliezer, again, we're re-quoting what we just said. Rebbe Eliezer apostles any animal bought from a non-Jew. And they both said, Mayo tivile chavarai Rebbe Eliezer. What did the other chachamim say to Rebbe Eliezer? And they quoted the pasuk in Yeshayo, Kol tzon kedar yikavtzulach. And Rebbe Eliezer said, well, that's not a proof, because in future times, the fact that other people are bringing animals is because kulam gerim gurim heim lati lavo. Right? And then it's just a repeat, but it's just different names. Ma'ikra, and so then they quote, how do you know that in the future that all the non-Jews or all the people bringing karbanot will become converts? Because it says, Ki ez az epochel amim safa bara lekro kulam b'shem Hashem. It's the same pasuk we quoted earlier. We're just quoting a few more words of it. They will all call out to Hashem in one clear language. And here, Matkifla Rav Yosef asked the same question we had before, which is, maybe they're just calling out to Hashem. They're only choser and they no longer serve Avodah Zarah, but how do you know that they're actually converts? Amalei Abaya, and here Abaya answers, it's because the pasuk continues and says, La'avdo Shechem Echad. They will worship together in one agreement, one treaty, one agreement, one consent, and so they, in fact, in that time can bring karbanot. Okay, so that is essentially the how we get away from the problem of non-Jews bringing karbanot to atid lavo. Ask the Gemara now. Today we are two lines.
We always say that on Sukkot there that 70 nations are bringing karbanot, and the Shmini Atzer is bifnei atzmo. That the Gemara somewhere. I mean, that's a chag bifnei atzmo when a kodesh preda chaviv alai. What's the pasuk? That's preda kashi alai. Kodesh Baruch Hu says to Bnei Yisrael. So that's a chag b'fnei atzmo, and the Bnei Yisrael bring the korban themselves Shmini Atzmo, as opposed to the 70 nations bringing during the week of Sukkot.
Correct. So let us read the Gemara. We're not going to ask from that, but we're going to ask a similar question, and the answer will apply, I think, to that as well. So says the Gemara, Meitzvah, 2 lines on the bottom. Yomer Moshe, now remember, this was in Mitzrayim. Moshe said to Paro, not only am I going out to worship Hashem, but gam ata titein biyadenu zachim va'olot. You're going to give us animals. Now, how could they take animals from the Egyptians? If you're worried that the non-Jews sleep with their animals, they can't get animals from them, how could Paro give them animals? Says the Gemara, Kodem Matan Torah Shani. Well, that was different. The rules were different before Matan Torah. You could take animals from a non-Jew. Okay, Tashma. What about the next case? It says, "Vayikach Yitro chotein Moshe." Right. This is in Yitro, of course. Yitro, the father of Moshe, was not Jewish. Took Ola usvachim lelohim. So how could Yisro bring an Ola and zvachim? He's not Jewish. And even though we love Yisro and everything, you have to be choshed that maybe his animals were used inappropriately. Because we're, well, Yisro nami kotem matan Toravi. Right? The whole story of Yitro, if you recall, in the beginning of Parshat Yitro, is before Matan Torah. So Yitro is Kodem Matan Torah. Says, well, you know, that's a big debate. According to that mandam, I get it. Elamanda Amar. Turn to that Chavdalam a bet. The Yitro Lachar Matan Torah Havi. Right? There's the whole debate in Zvachim about when Yitro came. If Yitro came after Matan Torah, so how could he bring a karban? Havi Ma'ika Lememar. Ella, and this I think Ken, I think answers your question. Second line of Daf Chavdal Amabet. Yitro mi Yisrael Zavan, right? Yitro bought it from a Jew. So remember, the problem that we're addressing here is not whether a non-Jew can bring a karban. A non-Jew can bring a karban. Of course, in Shlomo's temple, he talks very explicitly about all the non-Jews coming and bringing, sacrificing there. But the issue is that you can't bring their own animals potentially. So it sounds like a good deal for the Jewish, market, right? So they'd have to buy an animal from these preferred providers, like using the preferred caterer or something, right? So because you couldn't establish that an animal being brought from the home of a non-Jew was appropriate, they could only come to the Beit HaMikdash, let's say on Sukkot, and bring a karban that they bought from the people in the Beit HaMikdash. So that's the answers, that you can bring an animal, it just has to be checked properly. So that's how we explain it for Yitro. Tashma, okay, well, we got the next case, and we're going to go through a few cases in Tanakh where they seem to bring animals that came from non-Jews. Vayomer Shaul, right? Remember, this was, of course, the very sad and famous story where Shmuel came to Shaul and said, why didn't you kill, what's this sound that I hear, right? Remember, Shaul had killed the Amaleki, but he left behind Agag, the king, and he left behind the animals, right? Mikdavatzon. So Shmuel came and he said, what's the sound? What's the sound that I hear? Vayomer Shaul, the third line now, me Amaleki hevium. These are animals that we got from the Amalekites. Asher chamal ha'ama mikdavatzon v'abakar. The people had compassion and they saved and they didn't kill the best tzon and bakar, liman zavach l'Hashem elokecha, to slaughter them to God. Now, how in the world could you slaughter them to Hashem if they came from the Amalekim, right? Who you suspect have done inappropriate things. This is where, well, they weren't going to slaughter the animals. They were going to sell them and use the money to buy kosher animals. My meitav to me meitav. It means the value. This is where, well, if it's the main meitav, why do you have to say they're the best animals, right? If you're bringing the animals, you save the best animals for God. If you just want the money, you just want the money. Who cares how good the animals are? Tashmaishna meitav. Why do you need the best ones? No, so they would have a good market, right? Everyone wants them. So these are the thoroughbred, best animals. You can sell them quickly, get the money, and bring it to Hashem. Again, this is obviously not the simple shot of the pasuk, right? But that's how you'd have to explain. Tashma, get the next case. This is a case from way in the end of Shmuel Bet. Yomer Aravna el David, right? Remember, this was a story where David went to buy from the Yevusim, to buy the land, and Aravna, the Yevusi, said to David, Yikach v'yal Adoni HaMelech hatov beino, take whatever you want, right? Re'eh bakar la'olah, v'hamarigim u'klei bakar le'itzim. Look, you can use my bakar, my cows, my cattle, right, for olah, for karban olah, and the morigim, we're going to ask in a second what the morigim is, but we'll see it's going to be wood, obviously. And klei bakar, meaning the instruments you use to plow with the cows. You're killing the cows, so we don't need the instruments anymore. Use those leitzim, use those for your fire. So how could he take gifts from our Ravna Yevusi, who's not Jewish? Rav Nachman, a very new answer. Ravna ger toshav haya. Ravna was not Jewish, but he was a ger toshav. Remember, a ger toshav is someone who we trust, who lives in Eretz Yisrael, maybe, and does all the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. If you do the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, remember, it includes all sexual offenses, so you can't be worried that the person's going to commit this crime. And so therefore, you're allowed to take animals from a guy who is a ger toshav. Now, ask the Gemara, before we get to more cases, what are morigim, right? We said take the morigim as wood. What is a morigim? Amar Ula, it's mita shel turbil. It's the bed of the turbil. Says Gemara, what's that? My mita shel turbil. That is Iza de Kurkisa de Daishan. This is a board that is, Isa means that it has, Rashi explains that it has like cracks in it. It has like what do you call them? It's like not serrated, but it has like dots coming out of it, basically. That is used for daishan, for threshing. So Rashi explains it was basically a not soft board. It had a lot of projections in it, and they would put it on top of the grain, and the animals would walk over it. And as they walked over, they would put pressure on one spot more than the other spot, and it would crush the grain and loosen it up. And then you throw it up in the air, and it would, separate the grain from the chaff. So, anyways, not important for us, but the point is that that was a piece of wood that was used for threshing and was no longer needed, and they were going to use for them for burning for the karbanot. Now, Amar of Yosef, how do I know that from a pasuk that the word morig has something to do with threshing? Mikra, because there's a pasuk in Yeshayahu, very, very pasuk we quote. It says, "Hine samticha limorag charutz chadash." I'm going to make you a morag. It's the same word, which is charutz chadash bal pifiot. Right? It's made out of these. It's like pifiot means teeth, but meaning it has notches in it. Basically, these projections. Tadush harim, and you're gonna thresh or knock down basically the mountains. V'tadok ugivaot, and you'll make them small. Ugvaot kamot tasim, and you'll take the givaot, the hills, and make them like the moats, like the chaff that you throw away. Meaning you're gonna, whatever it is, right? It's obviously referring to a nevuah of conquering the world, but you're going to use this morag to basically thresh things. So that's how you know the morag is to do with threshing. Okay. So that is the next question. Now, says Gemara, let's go back a little bit. Because if you recall, there was another example in Shmuel where they used animals that were not from Jews for a karbanot. And if you recall, the story had to do when the Aron was captured, right, and taken by the Plishtim. And then there was the whole story, the Plishtim, they died, right, their Beit Dagon died. And if I recall all this story in Shmuel. And eventually the Plishtim said, okay, we're going to send this back because everyone who takes the Aron dies. And so they took two female cows, the story goes, who were nursing, and they had babies. They put the babies locked up so the mothers wouldn't want to leave the babies, and it was like a test. The mothers walked off to Israel with the Aron, and remember they were stopped in Beit Shemesh, and anyways, they had a whole thing. So it says in the pasuk, now, this is the context, that taparot he'alu olah Hashem. They took the parot and they brought them as an olah. How could you take these parot that carried the Aron back to Beit Shemesh? How could you slaughter these parot? You don't know what happened with them in the Plishtim's world. Maybe they were used for riviyah, for sex. So they should be possible. Well, you're right, but Horat Shaita, that was clearly a special occasion because they got the Aron back and they were celebrating. And so the rules were suspended. It was Horat Shah, and it must have been a Horat Shah. Hachanami Mistavra, it's clear. Dilo Temahachi, Ola Nikeva Miika. Remember, an Ola is always a male animal. These were female animals that were nursing. So you never bring a female Ola. So clearly, the whole thing was done as a special occasion for this miracle to mark God freeing the Aron. Says, well, that's not such a good question. My kushya, because Dilma bebamat yachid, right? Remember, there's a prohibition of bringing an Ola that's female on a public bama. Remember, but the public bama didn't quite exist at that time, or maybe it was in Nov. Shiloh was destroyed already. They moved it to Nov, but this was done in Beit Shemesh out in the field. How do you know that in Olah, that on a private bama, you can bring any carbon as an olah? It's not like in the Beit HaMikdash or the big bama that you have to bring only a male animal. And the way you know that, Shenemar, because there's a pasuk earlier in Shmuel as well, but it says, "Vayikach Shmuel tlei chalav echad v'alei olah." Shmuel took a tleh, what is tleh in English? Like a lamb that was milking, right? That was chalavu, so a mother lamb that was providing milk, and he brought it as an olah. How in the world could he have done that? Obviously, it's because it was a private mizbeach, so you're allowed to do it. Now, it says when you're talking about Shmuel, it says vayalehu, which meant he brought it. He brought him basically. That's Zachar mashma. That's a language of Zachar. You're right. It's not what the pasuk says. The pasuk is vayaleha without a vav, and we ktiv. That's how we read it at least. I'm sorry, it's written without a vav in the female form of that. So that Shmuel in fact brought a karban in the keva for ola, which you're allowed to do when it's a bamat yachid. So that's really not a question, but the question is, how could you bring an animal from the Plishtim as an olah? And the answer that we gave was that it was a one-time event. It was not generally permitted, but this was an exception. Now, that is the answer so far. We're around halfway down. Rabbi Yochanan says, I've got a whole new addition to this discussion about which animals are prohibited to buy from a non-Jew. Says, or to bring as a karban, but also to buy. Says Rabbi Yochanan, remember, we had a Mishnah which said you can't buy, Breita said you could. How do we resolve them? Says Rabbi Yochanan, I've got a whole new explanation for you. Rabbi Yochanan says, Gvul Yeshla, there's a gvul, there's a border, meaning there's a difference between a young age and an older age. You know, if an animal is less than 3 years old and it's immature and it's young and it is used sexually, that damages the animal's organs and makes it sterile. So that is very bad for the animal. And so a non-Jew does not want, and no one, of course, wants their animal to be worthless, to be sterile. And so there's no concern of having sexual relations with an animal in a non-Jewish home if the animal is less than 3 years old, because it's bad for ownership, bad for the animal. But if it's bat shalosh shanim, once it's 3 years old, then eino nekar, it doesn't necessarily result in that damage and cause it to become an akara, to become barren. And therefore, once an animal is 3 and it belongs to a non-Jew, you can't bring it as a karban because you have to assume that maybe someone slept with the animal. And so that adds a whole new addition, because now, if you review our whole daf today, which we're not going to do line by line, but every question, how could you bring a karban from a non-Jew? And Shanil, you can answer every single one as pchutami bat shalosh shanim, right? If the animal was less than 3 years old, then there's no problem, because we say even a non-Jew is going to protect their animal until it's 3, because sleeping with that animal would damage it. And so therefore you have now a whole different answer, which is that all these cases where they brought karbanot from a non-Jew, we're talking about animals that were young. Tashma, there's one problem with that, right? Because the problem was the case, the last case I gave you, second to last case, of the animals that came back with the Aron from Beit Shemesh, from Plishtim to Beit Shemesh. Because remember, I told you the case was, and this the pasuk talks about, where they said that basically they were mothers, that they were nursing mothers, and they took their babies and they locked them up behind the doors so that the mothers couldn't get them, and they would know that they're crying for them. But it says, I went ahead, but let's read first the first part. It said these animals were brought hataparot halu olal Hashem. The animals the 2 parot that brought back the Aron were brought as an olat Hashem. So we gave the same answer that we gave for everything else. Pchutam mibat shalosh shanim. Right? Rabbi Yochanan's answer is going to be that they were less than 3 years old. Right? But the problem is, Matkefla Rafuna Breder of Natan in Cain, how do you explain their children? Hainu, what do you say with the fact, and this is what I was referring to, it says, Vet b'neihem kalu babayit. They took their sons of these 2 cows and they locked them up in the house, right? So how in the world can you say that they were mothers and they had children locked up in the house? If you say that the mothers are less than 3 years old, is it possible for a animal that's less than 3 to give birth? Vatanya, we learned in a Breita, I think it's a Mishnah, right? Vatnan, right? We learned in a Mishnah in Bechorot the following. It says, let's say, this gets to this Mishnah in Bechorot talks about a very interesting question, which is, let's say, remember that if you have a par, or really any animal, or a chamar, the firstborn has to go to the Kohen, right? If you have a par, it's called, or an animal, it's a kosher animal, it's called bikurim. It's called bechar, sorry. And if it's a chamar, it's called peter chamar, right? Where you have to redeem the firstborn and give it to the value to the Kohen. But what about if you buy an animal and you don't know if it ever gave birth before, right? You go to this, it wasn't your own animal. You go to the market, you buy an animal, there's no knowledge, there's no medical history for that animal. You don't know if it was previously gave birth or not. So then you own that animal and then it gives birth. So is that a bechar or not a bechar? So the Mishnah says in Bechorot that if it's a para or a chamar mibat shalosh, if it's less than 3 years, I'm sorry, if it's less than 3 years old when you buy it, vadai lekohen, then any child that's born, the firstborn that's born after that, has to go to the Kohen. Meaning, it's definitely the firstborn, because the animal can never give birth before it hits 3 years old. Continues the Mishnah, Mikan ve'elech, after it's 3, safek, right? Then it's unknown whether it goes to the Kohen or not, because it might have had a child before, it might not. But you see from, again, we're not going to talk about Bechorot, it's not our sugya, but you see from here that you can assume that any animal that's 3 years old or younger has never had a child. Well, if that's the case, how can you explain the case in Shmuel that the animal that they brought as a karban was less than 3 years old, and therefore it was never slept with by its non-Jewish owner, if the pasuk says it had a child? Ella says, well, you're right. It's a mistake. It can't be the answer. Machverta, go back. Kiddushanina meikar. You have to give the original answer, which is that it was a horat shah, right? It was an exception. So it's really a case where we can explain why they brought an animal, and it must have been that they made a one-time special exception. Okay, so that is that, and we're actually at the end of that, but we're about to start a lot of really fun Agadata. So we're up to the 2 dots. I have 2 dots in my Gemara, at least. It's around 20 lines from the bottom. It says, now, this is the same story in Shmuel, where again, these animals, these cows were sent on their way, and they brought without a guide, and they directly walked to Yehuda, they walked to Beit Shemesh, and they deposited the Aron in that area. So the pasuk says, "Vayisharna parot b'derech al derech Beit Shemesh." Right? The animals went yashar, they went straight. But it's a strange word, vayisharna, right? You could say vayalech yashar. We don't usually use that phrase of vayisharna. So my vayisharna, Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Meir, it's from the word shira. Shamru shira, they sang all along the way. These cows were, taken over by the Spirit because they were bringing the Aron, and they sang all the way back to Beit Shemesh. And Rav Zutra Bar Tuvia Amarav says something very similar. It means sheyishru pneihem keneged Aron, that they were yashar, meaning they turned their head to be facing the Aron, which I guess was behind them. So I'm not exactly sure how they did that, but they turned their heads towards the Aron, the Amru Shira, and they sang. So everyone agrees that they did Shira. Says where my Shira Amru. What was the song of the cows bringing back the Aron? Amr Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Yana. Of course, what do you think it is? It was Az Yasher Moshe B'nai Yisrael, right? They sang the Shira that B'nai Yisrael sang. So the cows came back singing the Shira. Rabbi Yochanan Didei said, that's Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yochanan himself said, no, they actually sang the psukim in Yeshayahu, which says, Martem bayomahu, they'll say on that day, Hodul Hashem, Kiru Bishmo, right? God is great, Hodiu ba'amim al lilotav, right? All the people are going to mention Hashem. So that is Amim will call out Hashem. And Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Rish Lakish said, you know what they sang? They sang what's called Mizmora Yatzma. The orphaned mizmar. What's the orphaned mizmar? The orphaned mizmar is remember, usually, not always, but usually in Tehillim, it says mizmar li David, or mizmar la Asaf, or mizmar livnei Korach, right? A mizmar of somebody, or of something. But there's one mizmar, there's more, but there's one mizmar that doesn't have, it's mizmar, it says, and then it just goes into the mizmar, Shiru Hashem Shir Chadash, right, which we sing all the time, right? So mizmar to who? Right? It was the mizmar that says, sing to Hashem Shir Chadash, Ki niflaot asa, Hashem has made amazing things, Hoshia lo yamino. We have all this inside. Sorry, here we go. Yeah, the Hashem's right hand has saved things. So that Vizra Kacho, so the mizmar is unnamed, but it was sung by these animals coming back, by the cows coming back to Beit Shemesh. Rabbi Eliezer says, well, it's from the next parak in Tehillim, from 99, Hashem melech yirgizu amim. God is the king and all the nations tremble. So this is again, Hashem's miracle that is witnessed by all the people. And Reb Shmuel Bar Nachmani says, it's from a little bit earlier, it says Hashem melech malach geut lavesh. God is geut lavesh. Reb Yitzchak Nafcha says, where are we? Yitzchak Nafcha says 7 lines from the bottom. It's actually, the animals sang, but they didn't sing from Tehillim. They sang a different song. Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha comes up with a song again. There must have been a long tradition. It's a beautiful song. This is what they sang. Roni, Roni Hashita. Roni means sing, right? Sing the shita. The shita refers to the wood of the Aron. It was made out, let's say, shitim, right? Sing the wooden box. It's nofifi berov hadarech. You will fly up in your hadarech, in your glory. Hamichusheket b'rikmei zahav. You're covered with lines of gold. The Aron was covered with gold. Hamahulala b'dvir armon. You're made hulal. You're made whole. You're made exalted. You're made special in your armon, in your palace, which is how they refer to the beginning inside of the Aron. Umufu'ara ba'adi adayim, and you are made magnificent with your jewels and your covering and everything like that. So this was a special tefillah. Again, I don't know where this comes from, to be honest, but because it's not from Tehillim, it's not from any source, but a beautiful tefillah for the Aron. Now, Rav Ashi said, in fact, Matin Lahad Rav Yitzchak, he quoted this statement, this beautiful song of Rav Yitzchak, aha, about the following context, right? It says in Balotcha, we read it, but he recently, but he ben saw Aaron. It was when the Aaron traveled, right? Yomer Moshe, Kuma Hashem, Yifutzu Evecher, God will get up, spread your enemies. But that's what Moshe said. What did the people respond? What was the response of the people? Yisrael my Amru. And that's where Reb Yitzchak said this beautiful passage of Roni Roni Hashita, sing the wooden box, it's Nova Fibro of Haderech, the whole thing we just quoted a couple lines ago. So that's where they sang that beautiful song. Now, while we're on this topic, now this is not on the topic at all, but let's just finish today's daf. Says Rav, Kiman Karo Parsai L'Safra Devir. You know, in Persian, they call a sefer, a book, is called a devir. Where's that from? Now, I don't know why they're asking the question, but I guess there's a reference. It's from here, Mehacha. It says in the pasuk in Shoftim, right? It says V'shem Dvir Lifanim Kiryat Sefer. The place Dvir used to be called Kiryat Sefer. So you see that the word Sefer and the word Dvir are the same source, at least in some languages. Rav Ashi says, while we're on the topic of the Persians, Keman Kor Parsei Lenida Dashtana. The word for a menstruating woman in Persian is dashtana. You know what that's from? The etymology of that word is from dash nashim, right? Rashi says the shin is for nashim. So derech nashim. Remember that Rachel said to her father, "I can't get off my camel because derech nashimli." So that became over time into the language of dashtana in Persian. Again, I'm not really sure why they want to ask these questions, but that's what we say. We are going to stop here, even though because it's late. Tomorrow's daf we're going to do at 7:45. We're going to go quickly because Shachris I know starts at 8:15 in some places for the fast day. But it's a lot of Agadata, so it should be pretty quick. But we'll start at the first word on daf Chaf Hey Amud Aleph. I'm going to try to start on time, so I hope everyone can make it and join.
Yasher Kov, Shavua Tov.
Thank you, everyone. Shavua Tov. Have a good night.
La lechuza blanca.
Las mejores bicicletas del mundo se venden aquí.
Las mejores bicicletas del mundo se venden aquí.
No comiences a darme instrucciones.
Mi mamá y yo teníamos un vínculo especial.
Mi mamá y yo teníamos un vínculo especial.
Nuestro vínculo es débil. Círculo. Vínculo.
Qué atentos son tus hijos.
No comiences tu viaje tarde o habrá mucho No comiences tu viaje tarde o habrá mucho tránsito. No comiences tu viaje tarde o habrá mucho tránsito.
Busca tarifas para adultos menores de 30 años.
No seas tan competitivo. Competitivo yo. Solo quiero ganar. Ganar.
Good night.
Good
How are you?
night. Good night.
Yeah, it's not evening, so how are you?
I'm well. I'm well. I had a very full day, good day. We led a tour in the morning, a food tour in the Bronx, so that was fun.
A food
Um,
tour. Wow.
Only food tour I do. I always avoided them just because of the logistics and just having to buy food in crowded places, but. This one I like, and the woman who runs the company, she has roots in the neighborhood, and it's it's delicious Italian food. So yeah, I dig it. That was good, and then saw a friend solo show, and then I had a rehearsal for this play I'm writing that I have to perform in like 2 weeks. Crazy. And now I'm just coming back from this totally insane music party, insane, with lots of like fire and just madness. It was cool. So very happy day.
Wow. Where in the Bronx did you go? Ah, yes. Okay. Yep. That makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. I don't do it that often, but yeah. So that was good, and heading home.
Wow.
Yeah. So yeah, feeling abundant, I guess, especially with writing this thing that weird. I don't know if calling it like pop-up performances, but they give us it's like a month. It's kind of insane. I guess maybe they're not expecting people to write something new, but I'm not even done writing this thing. We're doing it too. Anyway, whatever. It's all good. It's just kind of like seat of the pants kind of, but got some good responses today. I just feel like the busier I can make myself, and in some cases, the more deadlines, the more likely I am to put things together.
Yeah, I need deadlines.
Yeah.
And I need to be busy. Although the last couple of weeks have been way too busy. But I'm over it for a while.
Yeah, I got you. How's it going? Just budget wise and your job and all that.
Yeah, I'm actually fine. At least it looks like I'm fine for the next year.
Well, that's great.
Yeah, so I'm I had some a couple of grants renewed this week, late, but they got renewed. Yeah, so, and I am gonna get reimbursed for a trip to Boston I took, which was not certain that was gonna happen. So, yeah, so, I'm, at the moment, I'm fine. I'm just tired because I've been working so hard.
Yeah. And you flew to Vancouver, so that's a lot too.
And came back on a red eye, which I think I want to give up red eyes.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah.
Flying is bad enough.
Yeah, I hate flying. I take Amtrak whenever I can.
Yeah.
But outside of, well, I've taken Amtrak to Montreal. That's the furthest I've ever taken Amtrak. But anywhere Boston to Richmond, I will take Amtrak.
Well, you're less likely to get hit with delays on the East Coast, I think, right?
Yeah, Amtrak is reliably a half hour late, but I've never had them be more than half hour late.
Trying to go like across the country, and then you hit all the freight lines. It's madness, I hear.
Yeah, because Amtrak doesn't own the tracks. The freight railroads own the tracks. And Boston to Washington is owned by Amtrak, except for New Rochelle to New Haven, which is owned by Metro North. And the track from Richmond to Washington was recently bought back by Virginia, which had actually owned it from the 19th century until the 1990s in a very complicated. It's actually very complicated. They controlled it without even having the majority ownership in it. There's some very, very complicated histories. I once took Amtrak from San Diego to Los Angeles, and that was a delight. And I don't know who owned that track, but it was on time. I think it might have been 5 minutes late. But it was a very nice trip.
I like train travel a lot. I got my step 6 done. I was wondering if you think I should just continue on with 7, and then next time we meet, we can just power through both of them. It's not really that.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I'm much more free now than I have been for the past 3 weeks.
Same here. I'm gonna leave town tomorrow and go spend time with my folks out in Long Island and unwind a little. I'll be back probably Tuesday. So, and I'm kind of, I don't know if you have time later in the week or whatever, but maybe we can link up.
I might be. Let's talk about it when you get back. All right. Good to hear things are going well.
Likewise.
All right. Thanks. All right. All the best.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Oh.
Cuántos elogios. Cuántos elogios.
¿Cuántos elogios?
Mamá recibió muchos elogios por su comida.
Por favor, no hacen falta
It
tantos
was great. Dr. Oberstein's fabulous. Yeah.
Por favor, no hacen falta tantos elogios.